To commemorate the 80-year anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944, I have this special video for you where I want to do something similar to what I did a few years ago for Operation Market Garden, and that is to go through the memoir of Private David Webster of the 101st Airborne Division. Because before he jumped into the Netherlands with Operation Market Garden, in June of that year he had already jumped into Normandy. And there is one engagement in particular that he describes in his usual detail, and that is on D+1, so on the 7th of June, at the small Norman village of Vierville. And what I want to do is go through Webster's eyewitness account of this action, but also include some other sources that I have found that will really round out this engagement and provide a bit more context into things that Webster couldn't have known at the time. So it will be a bit like a prequel to the larger Market Garden series that you can find over on the main channel. Now, before starting with Webster's eyewitness account, I do have to provide a little bit of background information, starting with Webster himself, because at the time in June 1944, he wasn't yet in easy company, as would be the case later during Operation Market Garden. At the time he was actually in the headquarters company of 2nd Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. So that 2nd Battalion had 3 rifle companies, being Dog, Easy and Fox, and then a headquarters company that included a machine gun platoon, and Webster was an ammunition bearer in that machine gun platoon. So he carried boxes of ammunition for the Browning machine guns. And he still jumped into the first wave. So right after midnight on the 6th of June, he jumped with the 101st Airborne Division. So he really was there right from the start, and he was also in combat. This was his baptism of fire. Now, as for the overall tactical situation, it is quite confusing, so I'll try to keep it short. But the main thing to consider here is that these American airborne landings are all taking place behind Utah Beach. So that's the westernmost of the invasion, of the Allied invasion beaches. And this is on the Carentan Peninsula. So you have the 82nd Airborne dropping here around Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and then to the south of it was the 101st drop zone. And they had a number of objectives, all in support of the amphibious landing that would then take place on Utah Beach at dawn on the 6th of June. So the paratroopers went in at midnight, and then the beach assault at first light. Now, what's the almost defining about the Normandy airborne landing is how chaotic and scattered they were. That's one of the problems of a night drop. And that makes it kind of difficult to see the overall picture here. There were a number of objectives all around the place, but the American paratroopers had difficulty actually completing those in a organized manner. So small groups of paratroopers did what they could on D-Day itself, but they couldn't really strike out as a organized whole in battalions and regiments in the way that you see in Market Garden until really on D+1. So for the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment that Webster belonged to, they were getting organized on the evening of D-Day. You had Colonel Sink, the regimental commander, had his command post at the time set up in Vierville, tiny little village, just outside Vierville. And he had elements of his 1st and 2nd Battalion, and the 3rd Battalion was still just missing at this time. It really shows just how scattered the landing was. But the division commander, General Taylor, he and Colonel Sink, they came up with a plan for the next day with the forces that they had available to them, and that was to set out from Vierville, where they had organized, and then advance down this road to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. So you see the bigger picture over here, and you can see the roads are very important. So you have the Utah Beach exit, and then this road in particular goes through Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Vierville, and then it connects to this main road over here at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. And this road goes all the way to the critical port city of Cherbourg on the tip of the Carentan. And then to the south of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, it goes over the Douve River into Carentan. And Carentan was a key objective for the 101st Airborne, because it would connect the exits from Utah Beach with those leading out of Omaha Beach to the east. So it would unify the American beachhead. But in order to get to Carentan, the 101st would first have to advance down the road, take Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and from there they could then attack in the days after over the Douve River into Carentan. And here you see it in more detail. So that's this blue arrow over here is the 506th attack on D+1, so the 7th of June. And here you see it in more detail. It's the 1st Battalion is leading the attack, followed by the 2nd Battalion where Webster is in. And they would set out early in the morning on D+1. Now, as the Americans were drawing up their plans in the evening of D-Day, the Germans were also counterattacking. And well, on the German side, the coastal defenses in the Utah sector, they weren't all that impressive, but they had reserves deeper inland. And those included the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, led by Major von der Heide, an experienced German paratroop commander. And yeah, this was a paratroop regiment, so they were the equals to the American paratroopers in a sense. And the reason they were actually inland here, so they had been in Normandy for a little while, roughly in the Carentan area, precisely as an anti-invasion reserve, specifically to deal with Allied airborne landings. And because they were paratroopers themselves, they knew how critical it was to attack right away in that early reorganization phase. So as soon as this German regiment heard the alarm that paratroopers were landing around midnight on the 6th of June, von der Heide concentrated his regiment in Carentan and marched them across the Douve River into Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where he set up his regimental command post. And then this took almost the entire 6th of June because they were on foot. So they were marching, yet Allied air attacks. So it was only on the evening that he could actually issue his orders for an attack. So he sent one of his battalions up this road to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where the 82nd had landed. And then he sent his 1st battalion up this road. That's the exact same road that the Americans were also planning to attack down the next day. And this 1st battalion was given orders to advance as far as Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, or even further to the beach if they could. And, well, a lot of things happened to this 1st battalion, and it's not going to end well for them the next day. So they set out in the evening, it was already getting dark, and they lost radio contact with the regiment. So at this point, von der Heide just was, he had no clue where the battalion, what their status was. And as it was getting dark and they were marching up this road, American reinforcements came in by air. This was a planned airlift on the first evening of D-Day itself. And they came in airborne reinforcements, so gliders and parachutes, and some of those came down almost on top of this German battalion as it was marching in the sort of Vierville, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont area. And it just completely threw them in disarray. And they were essentially now surrounded behind American lines, and the battalion commander realized that his force had essentially marched into a pocket. So they hunkered down for the evening in the fields off the road, somewhere between Vierville and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. And this is a very marshy area. You can see the river running here as well. So this is all low-lying swampland, and then this road is on higher ground. And at first light, they would pull back to their own lines at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Like I said, they didn't have contact with the regiment anymore, but that is also precisely what von der Heide wanted them to do. But actually getting there proved difficult, and that's what the entire battle of the next day is going to be about, including the Vierville engagement, is that the Americans are attacking southwest along this road to hit Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. But at the same time, you have this German paratrooper battalion essentially trapped on their flank behind American lines, attacking in the same direction. So it is this running battle. They are attacking in parallel directions, the Americans to take Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and then this trapped German battalion to go back to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. And this leads to a bunch of skirmishes throughout the morning as this German battalion is being bounced around between all kinds of American positions, because there were also Americans along the crossing points on the river here. So this battalion, this German battalion, really was trapped in a terrible position. And as they're trying to fight their way back to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, elements of this German battalion try to enter Vierville. So this is the detailed map, and this is then a sketch of Vierville as far as I could sketch it out. But yeah, so anyway, elements of this trapped German battalion try to enter Vierville on the morning of the 7th of June, just as the Americans are also marching through the village on their way to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. So you get this sort of a meeting engagement taking place in the streets and the hedgerows around Vierville, and that is where Webster comes in. So as you can see, the 1st Battalion had already gone through without too much trouble, but as the 2nd Battalion, so the second wave, is making their way through Vierville, at that time those Germans are also entering the village from the other side. So you get this meeting engagement taking place in the village, and the battle there is between 9 and 11-ish in the morning. And yeah, let's just jump right into Webster's account. That is about all the background I can provide. So yeah, let's just start right away. To quote Webster, "This was Vierville, about June 8, on the road to Carentan. 2 rifle companies had already passed through town without opposition. Headquarters company was diverting itself for some brief, ecstatic moments, shooting every weapon it had at a lone sniper in the church steeple. I had lain in the gutter, watching the marksman, until a bullet from the belfry spattered the dust in front of my nose. Then I had moved across the road to a deeper ditch in the shade of a thick stone wall. Shortly after this, our lieutenant had shifted us forward to some other ditches just beyond town, and a rumor spread that there was free cider in the farmhouse at the last crossroads. Always the conservative soldier, I waited until the rumor was confirmed by the sight of men with full canteen cups coming from there before I buckled my gear, slung my rifle, and strolled leisurely toward the farmhouse courtyard where Sergeant Hoagie and other machine gunners were sunning and sipping." So, based on this description, as far as I could sketch out Vierville, and this is based on maps I could find as well as the modern satellite imagery, and thankfully a lot of the buildings have remained in place. So the 506 was taking this minor road into town that led from their concentration point at Couleuville into Vierville, roughly from the north. So presumably Webster would have entered the town here as well. And it may have been here that then they took sniper fire from the church steeple, which must have surprised them, because not only had the 1st Battalion marched through, but Webster says 2 of the 2nd Battalion companies, presumably those were Dog and Easy, had also marched through town without trouble. But now Headquarters Company runs into this German force that has snuck in. And then at some point he says a lieutenant has shifted them through some ditches beyond town. So based on his description with the crossroads, and later he mentions a church and the farm building with the courtyard, it all sounds like he had actually moved beyond town and was along the main road here, which is lined with ditches and hedgerows. And he says he walks back to where the cider is, which, based on his description, I think is at this junction with a minor road that leads around the church. And then this building is still there. There's a large Norman farm compound with thick stone walls that Webster describes, as well as a courtyard, and that's where the cider is. So he's making his way over there. But at that time, those German troops are infiltrating from the southeast, past the large manor building that is just outside of town, and a skirmish takes place between the Germans entering Vierville from the southeast and then the Headquarters Company troops that are waiting along this road next to this farm building. So to continue with Webster, as a firefight is about to break out. "Crowds," someone yelled. I stopped in my tracks and whipped my rifle off my shoulder, clicking it off safety. An M3 grease gun submachine gun spat angrily near the intersection 20 yards ahead of me. Sergeant Hoagie's sunbathers vanished into the courtyard, while Captain Cox, our company commander, leaped back from the corner of the nearest hedgerow, cursing and yanking at his M3 in an effort to clear a stoppage. "Crowd troopers," he shouted. "They're dug in along the road here. Kill 'em! Kill the sons of bitches!" Tech Sergeant Stoney from Battalion S2 ran up the ditch and took the captain's place at the corner with another M3. Just as he leaned out to fire, a German leveled a machine gun on him and caught him in the face with a short burst. He spun around and lay still, his gun clattering to the pavement behind him. Sergeant Hoagie's men took up firing positions at the courtyard gateposts and began to shoot back at the Germans. A rifle grenade tumbled through the air end over end toward them and exploded in the courtyard. Sergeant Hoagie reeled out of the cloud of oily black smoke, blood streaming down his face, and staggered up the road to the medics. Its cider siesta over, Headquarters Company abruptly came to life. Everybody who had been relaxing in the ditches took up firing positions behind the hedges. A cloud of white smoke began to drift towards us from the other end of town, and when I looked over my hedgetop, I saw dozens of Germans running through some woods in the low ground 300 yards to my direct front. They were working their way up a wall to my right, evidently planning to cut us off from the rest of the battalion. I started shooting like mad. So here Webster for the first time sees a live enemy in the field and he opens fire at them. And based on his description, if he is indeed at this corner of the hedgerow near the intersection by the side of the road, then he presumably saw those dozens of Germans running through the low-lying fields, as he says, presumably in the wooded area around the manor building. And that ties in perfectly with a German source that I found that covers the history of this German Fallschirmjäger regiment. This is the Lions of Carentan, written by Griesser, a German historian. And it covers this action of the lost German battalion that is now engaging 2nd Battalion at Vierville. And it includes the following description of their fight at the village, to quote: "During their rapid crossing of the area around Vierville, the battalion ran into an American ambush that broke up and to some extent scattered the unit. The Fallschirmjäger companies engaged in a firefight in order to fight clear a path for their own forces. In small groups, the Fallschirmjäger tried to break out of the encircled area below the castle of Vierville and to withdraw toward the locks of La Barquette." Now this castle of Vierville almost certainly refers to this large manor building. So it's not really a castle in the medieval sense, but based on this description, this fits in perfectly with where Webster saw those dozens of German paratroopers, whereas in fact there were actually companies of them, so quite a large number, trying to fight their way past, maybe even through Vierville, where they then ran into those elements of 2nd Battalion. So, continuing with Webster's account, Colonel Strayer, so that's the 2nd Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Strayer. Colonel Strayer ran down the ditch, took a quick look at the low ground and shouted, "Get those goddamn tanks back up here." A runner departed at high speed to overtake a column of 2nd Armored Division tanks that had passed through us shortly before. "Crowds in the graveyard," someone yelled near the church. The cry kindled a spluttering, banging firefight. At the far end of town, from which we had come half an hour before, the white smoke rolled closer and closer. I imagined a Tiger tank creeping up on white, clanking treads to blast us with its 88 and hose the ditches with machine guns. While I watched the smoke, a German jeep popped out of it and whirled boldly through the village. It was flying a big red cross flag and carried 2 wounded Germans on stretchers in back, and it was such a startling phenomenon, with a big, husky German paratrooper at the wheel, that nobody made a move to stop it. It drove boldly down the middle of the road until it was finally stopped by an officer with more presence of mind than the rest of us. The jeep was commandeered. The driver, a medic, was shot for carrying a pistol, and the 2 wounded men were left by the side of the road to die. So this incident is almost certainly also described in the German history I quoted before, because it describes something that has to be the same incident. All the details line up. To quote from the Lines of Carentan, during the night, the staff doctor, Dr. Roos, the leading medical practitioner of the regiment, tried to break through in a Kubelwagen to the 1st Battalion under the protection of the Red Cross in order to offer medical relief. He did not make it. Roos fell into an American ambush and was shot. Some Fallschirmjäger found him dead in his Kubelwagen near the church of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Now this location is wrong. According to Webster it was Vierville, but from the German perspective, whoever these Fallschirmjäger were that witnessed this and how they lived to tell their tale is not entirely clear, but regardless, that they misplaced it at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont makes perfect sense, because those villages are just down the road from each other. They both have church towers. So given the confusing situation and the state of the German battalion, it makes perfect sense that they confused one church tower for the other. But all the other details line up. So a Kubelwagen, Webster calls it a German jeep. They both say they were under the protection of the Red Cross. And there was indeed well, Webster calls it a medic, but it was in fact the regimental doctor, so the highest ranking medical officer. And he was shot by the Americans. So not an ambush, but a straight up execution, according to Webster, who witnessed the event. So an interesting connection here in the source material. Continuing with Webster again. Now a big, blonde private from the communications platoon shoved a tall, terrified young German parachutist along the road at the point of his carbine. The German walked quivering, his hands folded on top of his ball helmet. His eyes rolled from side to side in fear and curiosity as he blinked down at the men watching him from the ditch. When the shooting flared up, his captor halted him and tried to make him lie down, but the German, who was afraid he was going to be shot, pretended not to understand the order. Eddie Weeks, a Brooklynite ex-boxer and a character in his own right who had drifted back from D Company, jumped up, ran over to the prisoner and slammed him savagely down on his face. "Cut it out, Weeks," someone yelled. "Lay off the son of a bitch." Weeks returned sulkily to his ditch, and a GI who spoke the language told the German to lie flat till the shooting was over. Cheered on by the rifleman, 3 dusty tanks clattered back down the road. Their commander studied the situation in a maddeningly leisurely fashion and then went into action. I was so absorbed in my own shooting that I didn't notice one of the tanks move up behind me, stop and swing at 75 across the hedge near my ear. It fired and the blast almost blew me off my perch. I jumped down with a curse and took up a more distant position. Now those 3 tanks, Webster claims earlier they were of the 2nd Armored Division, but that's actually not correct. They were from the 746th Independent Tank Battalion that had landed on Utah Beach on D-Day and was now being parceled out to all the American infantry units fighting in the area. And it were elements of their A Company that had moved in to support the 506th Regiment. And we actually know how this Vierville battle went from their perspective, because I found the original after-action report that they wrote on this action, and it is short but still very interesting. To quote, "On reaching Vierville, the elements of the 101st were found pinned down in the streets and ditches. The enemy was engaged in the village. 1 enemy AT gun and 106 enemy paratroopers were taken after an action of 1.5 hours. The company had 3 tanks in the action: Captain Hedges, Sergeant Rainey and Sergeant Cox. Of the 3, it lost 1 to bazooka fire, PFC Wilson being killed and Sergeant Cox seriously wounded in action." And that this after-action report mentions 3 tanks is very interesting, because Webster is the only paratrooper who also mentions 3 tanks. All the other American paratrooper sources talk about either 2 or 4, which really shows just Webster's attention to detail and how he really gets all the little facts right. So that's interesting. But yeah, so they lost one tank to a bazooka, which either refers to a Panzerfaust or a Panzerschreck. But despite this loss, they did inflict a tremendous amount of damage on these German Fallschirmjäger, who were now really doomed as they were just cut off and surrounded in this swampy area. And they really didn't have a proper answer to these Sherman tanks that were really just cutting into them with high explosive shells and machine gun fire. To continue with Webster's account. That was Vierville, a town nobody ever heard of. The skirmish there was typical of the early fighting in Normandy. Groups of paratroopers would inadvertently bump into wandering bands of supermen. There would be a brief firefight, and one side would get fire superiority and move in for the kill. As it was, the tanks won Vierville for us with their high explosive shells and 50 caliber machine guns. The main body of Germans, which I had seen running through the woods, bogged down in a swamp there and were piled up dead 2 and 3 deep by the tank's cannon. It was a battalion of our enemy counterpart, the 6th Parachute Regiment, and this was its first time in action. When he surrendered, the battalion commander crawled out of his CP on his hands and knees with tears in his eyes, begging not to be shot, for a particularly vicious and not overly brave person in our company was killing some wounded prisoners nearby. It was reported that the German commander lost more than 2/3 of his men in that one short action. Now this is again a atrocity that Webster very honestly describes in detail. And again, this is mirrored in the German history, and it even includes an eyewitness account that describes what must be the same atrocity going on here. This is again from the Lions of Carentan, and it is an eyewitness account by Manfred Vogt of the 4th Company of the doomed 1st Battalion. To quote, "In the chaos I had lost my weapon, and I lay with an older Obergefreiter under a hedge for cover. At the edge of the swamp, we observed how a few Americans gave one of our wounded a good once-over. With fists and the butts of their weapons, they beat the poor guy and kicked him with their boots. When he could no longer move, one of the Americans put his foot on the guy's head and pushed him into the water until he drowned." So, again, the details seem to line up here. The German source says he was drowned, Webster says it happened in a swamp. The German source says there are multiple perpetrators. Webster describes only a single one. He doesn't name him, but he does know him because he describes his personality as particularly vicious and not overly brave. So, yeah, just a very grim story. But to complete Webster's narrative of this battle, Stoney was our only casualty. Stoney, the quiet, stocky Indian from S2. But every village had a Stoney, or 2 Stonies, or many more, because that is how wars are finally fought and won. Not by rich factories and the coddled Air Force, but by the infantry, who take the ground and kill the enemy. And the infantry is Stonies. So the battle for Normandy would continue, and Webster, along with the 506th Regiment, in the coming days, they would take Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, attack down the road, over the Douve River, and then fight for control of Carentan, which was their important objective to take. And they would have to defend it as well against counterattacks, including also the remaining elements of the German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. And this was a continuing rivalry. If you remember from my Market Garden series, where we also follow in Webster's footsteps, then during the end of Market Garden, they fight again against the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, still under command of Major von der Heydte. But anyway, that's in the future. What happens in Normandy is Webster gets wounded at some point during the fighting around Carentan. He gets hit in the arm by a German mortar splinter and is evacuated back to England. And as he is recovering there, he volunteers to go to one of the rifle companies. He wants to see more action. So that is how he ends up in Easy Company by the time of Market Garden in September. And the full story you can see over on the main channel in my 3-part series on Webster and Easy Company in Market Garden. But there was a bit of a prequel to that, showing Webster's first combat experience in June 1944. And these events are now a little over 80 years ago. And in a few months' time, the Market Garden events will also be 80 years ago. And when that time comes, you can see the full story over on the main channel in the Private Webster's War trilogy. But this has been the prequel to that, covering Webster's experience in Normandy. Thank you for watching.